The last time I made Megan cry, how's that for a beginning of a sermon? You know what I mean? The last time I just said something that made her cry was I was laying in bed. I was just kind of floundering at work. I was so bored at work I couldn't sleep any, you know what I mean, the whole thing. And she's half asleep, and I go, look, I think I'm ready to quit my job, and I'll go do this thing over here, and it'll work out that way. And she just started bursting into tears. And I go, what is going, she went from half asleep to just weeping in my bed, all right? And I go, what is going on? She goes, this is the worst time for me to go back to work, Garrett. You can't ask me to do that. I'm like, did you not even listen? I didn't say I wanted you to go back to work. It's going to be great. I'm going to go do this thing over there. And she's like, there's not a thing you're talking about. That's not a thing. You can't do this to us. And I was sitting there going, how did I get in this conversation? She wants me to tell her what I'm thinking sometimes, and I tell her, and this happens, you know what I mean? How did I end up here? And the reason is because in marriage there's two people. And in marriage, you don't really see things the same way. You don't go about making decisions the same way. You don't have the same sort of hopes and same sort of parameters that make you understand how to make decisions the same way. So when you have something that comes up in your mind, you go, man, this is quite obvious that this is how we should make this decision. The other one of you is going to look at you side-eyes and go, why are you doing that? You're like, I don't know, I just thought it was obvious. He's like, it's not, it's weird, stop doing that. And you kind of look at each other and you go, who is this person? Because you don't really understand each other. And the difference that my wife and I had in that moment was she needed to have some sense of security. She wanted to be able to know, where's the next thing coming from? How's the next thing going to happen? Where's this going to be? And I'm sitting there going, I shouldn't just be sitting here like this. I should be wrestling some dragon to the ground right now. I should be accomplishing some enormous thing that I can do. And this should not be where I am. And that those two things were utterly in conflict. And I noticed this actually when I was in Bible college, because I'd sit across the cafeteria table with my other biblical studies majors, and we'd talk about the future. And I know they're going to be in the mission field or youth ministry or some sort of thing. And these guys, we all had big, big plans. We're going to do something amazing for Jesus. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. We don't know how we're going to do it. We're not going to have any health care. We're not going to do anything like that, but it's going to be great. We just know it. You're like, well, where's the system you're going to work in? I don't know. It's going to be out there. Where are you going to get your money from? I don't know. It's going to be out there. I don't know. If there's not a church, I'll plant a church. Or, and then I would, and we didn't have any real plans. We just knew we wanted to do something big. And then I'd look next to my friend's, the seat next to him, it'd be his girlfriend, and they were going to one day get married because that was the plan since high school. And what was her plan? Early childhood education. No matter where you go in America, there's going to be a paycheck. It's going to have benefits. It's going to have a plan. It's always going to be there. And his plan for the future was let's go ride a tornado, and her plan was, I got to know what's coming up. And you find yourself in this scenario, you kind of go, okay, how do we make decisions to you and me? How do we do this? How do we work through this problem? And okay, I feel like Michael really messed me up because he told me to make that comment about UNC. Okay, drop it, guys, all right? Duke lost, okay, get over it. But here's the deal. It's just interesting how men and women just think through things differently. I saw we don't have time for this, but we're going to do it anyways. I saw this show on Netflix called Cooked. If you've not seen this show, it's really a cool show. It's got 4 episodes. It's broken down into different elements about fire, water, and steam. And there's one episode at the end about Captain Planet. But you guys got to wake up, okay? I'm going to keep going until you at least breathe, okay? And the guy goes and it's a cultural study about food in the world, right? And he goes and he takes this journey to go see these people who are ancestors of they were indigenous people to Australia, right? And they're now modernized. They live in town and they wear clothes like you and I do. But once a year they have this festival. They have this feast where they go out into the bush and they live like their ancestors did. They hunt for their food like their ancestors did. And the men and the women separate into hunting parties, and the men get their rifles and they go off into the countryside and they go hunting for kangaroos. And they're fast and they're strong and you can't get close to them because they're too skittish. And if you ever get them, you're going to have to chase them down. It's going to be an amazing hunting trip. And the women stayed like within a mile of camp, and they set this little plot of land on fire. And then after it all dies down, they get a club and they walk through and they find a giant lizard tail and they smack it on the head and they put it in their bag and they go to the next one. And it's the easiest hunting trip you'll ever see. And every single year, all the food is taken care of. We know we're going to have a meal because the women had a system of how to get it all put together. But every once in a while, the men come back with that kangaroo. And it's like, yes, we got the good stuff. But there's also times where they come back completely empty-handed. And it's just fascinating to me to watch people be like, man, okay, these are the people who are marrying each other. These men and women are the people who are marrying each other. And you got to learn how to make decisions. You got to learn how to live together. You have to learn how to do things that allow both of you to exist and survive and make do in this thing called marriage. And here's my thesis for what I'm going to be talking about today, is that in the family, God created the most healthy, safe, and beneficial environment for personal growth and human flourishing. That's what I believe. That's what I'm going to argue for today. That when God put us into these things called families, He put us in these environments that were made for us to grow in and to flourish in. Now, the problem is that often families today struggle with this. And families throughout history have struggled with this. But we're in that part of Ephesians where we're talking about how Jesus Christ has affected different areas of our life. And today he's talking about the family. How Jesus has affected the family. So if you have your Bibles, open up to Ephesians chapter 5. We're going to go through 5:21 through 6:4. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, for his body, which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing of water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one has ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does for the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and a wife must respect her husband. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment that comes with a promise, so that in it may go well with you and you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. All right. We have reached a section of Scripture that nobody likes. Nobody likes it. And it's this strange drawing of a family that Paul puts down. And you and I, living in 2024, are tempted to look at it and go, isn't that cute? Wow, wasn't that nice that could work for them back there in that quaint little world for them? But for us today, it's just kind of strange. It's a strange version of a family. It doesn't really work. It doesn't really matter. But maybe it did for them back then, but we've kind of progressed. But here's my argument I want to make for you. The family that Paul draws up here has always been strange. It has always been different than what the culture around it was like. In fact, it was so strange that people didn't really know what to do with it. A couple years ago, like 20 years ago, HBO produced a show called Rome. In Rome, the people who made Rome said the most difficult thing about making that show was trying to imagine a world that was never influenced by Christianity. That never for 1 second had any influence of Jesus Christ. That was the big thing, because you and I are so engulfed in a world that has been 2,000 years of the influence of Christ in our lives that we think a lot of things are normal that are not normal. And that leads William Barclay to say this: no one reading this passage in the 20th century can fully realize how great the passage is. Because we're tempted to just scoff at it and walk away. And he goes in and he wants to say, he shows, there's 3 parts in his commentary about how marriage and families looked at this time in history. And he starts with Judaism and then Greeks and the Romans. And he says this: at the time of Christ's coming, the marriage bond was in peril even among the Jews. So much so that the very institution of marriage was threatened, since Jewish girls were refusing to marry because their position was so uncertain. They were treated as property. They didn't want to involve anything. And so marriage was just degrading in their society. And then he says, but the situation was worse in the Greek world. Prostitution was an essential part of the Christian life. The Greeks were expected his wife to run his home, to care for his legitimate children, but he found pleasure and companionship elsewhere. And in Rome, the matter was still worse. Its degeneracy was tragic. Historians said things like women dated their years by how many husbands they had. One historian said he met a woman who had 8 husbands in 5 years. The marriage bond was on its way to complete breakdown. And as for the children in the world, here's a letter that one Roman guy writes to another. He says, if you, good luck to you, have a child, if it is a boy, let it live. If it is a girl, throw it out. And you told Aphrodisias, who's his wife, to tell me, do not forget me. How could I forget you? I beg you, therefore, not to worry. Did you hear? It's not just a callous world the guy's living in. He's very gregarious and kind, and oh, this is great. It's good to hear from you. I love you. You're my buddy, my pal. And then when you think about throwing a child out to just die from exposure, it's just completely callous and hardened over. And this is the world. This is the dim, black world on which the gem of Christian marriage and family was set like a diamond on a black velvet backdrop. Where Paul comes to these people and looks at these people and says, submit one to another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as you do the Lord. And husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Fathers, parents, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. See, the Christian family was always strange. In fact, I would argue that it was more strange for the culture Paul was writing to than it is for us. Which is funny, because our temptation when we read the Bible is to always go, oh, Paul, what a product of his time. Oh, Paul, what just trapped by his culture. What a guy who couldn't get out of his culture, but we know better now. No. We're the ones that want to live like our culture. Paul was the one that's more than willing to suffer and die and get beaten and humiliated for not being part of the culture. He was more than willing to go against the culture. And yet he comes and he says, Christians, this is what Christ means to your families. This is what I'm looking for. And one of the things that's so strange about this is if you start looking into the passage, because is that when you read what Paul is saying about the family, you see that no one really ends up on top. Right? If there's some sort of political guide to, I'm going to do this so that we can have a certain thing, someone's going to end up on top. But who ends up on top in the Christian family? Jesus does. Jesus ends up on top. Look at the words we've read. Out of reverence for Christ, as you do to the Lord, love wives as Christ loves the church. Obey your parents in the Lord. Raise them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord. It's Jesus who's on top of the mountain. And here's the thing, that That when you and I realize that none of us belong at the top of the mountain, our lives, we can start growing in our humanity. We can start growing in our relationship with God because it is Jesus who belongs at the top of the mountain. And we find our place somewhere else. And then Jesus says this, whoever finds their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. And remember what I'm arguing for here. I'm arguing that what Paul's calling us into, what God has created for us, I'm arguing is the most healthy, safe, beneficial environment for personal growth and human flourishing. That's what I believe. I don't believe the modern day image that marriage is modern day slavery. I don't know. I believe it is one of the most benefit things that's ever been a part of my life and can be part of your life. But yeah, it's strange. So what is the structure of this strange family? Well, throughout history, it actually became so successful and so widely adopted because it was just a successful thing that we eventually one day named it. It became known as the nuclear family, right? This mom and dad and kids, right? They're just this group living together in this thing. And the structure is this: a man and a woman find each other and marry each other, and they have kids, preferably in that order. That's the hope. Doesn't always happen that way, and God makes a lot of gardens out of messy situations, but that's the hope. And it's very interesting. These two people come together. They're very different. They have very different motivations, and they live together. And it's, men are often motivated by sex, and women are motivated by some random thing. I don't know. Don't ask me. How am I supposed to know what women are motivated by? Okay. But what the Bible draws marriage up to be is a partnership. These two people come together and they live and go through life together. In the Garden of Eden, in the very beginning of the Bible, God says, I'm going to make for man a helper suitable for him. He can't go through life alone. He needs someone to come and round him out and complete and that whole thing. And we often get tied up on that phrase, helper suitable for him. But that word helper is often used of God, right? Here are some of the Psalms. It says, "Hear, Lord, and be merciful to me. Lord, be my help." The Lord helps them and delivers them. God is within her, and she will not fall. God will help her at daybreak. So this is not an idea of, I've got this idea and you just come help me. No, it's this partnership where this very real help, and we kind of work together and create this family. And what happens as you come together is you have to learn how to live in a house together. You adjust to each other. You change, and I come towards you a little bit, and you come towards me a little bit, and I don't always get to have things my way, and you don't always get to have things your way, and it's like marriage is like a giant gym tumbler where these two ragged and jagged gyms get in this barrel together, and they tumble, and every time they bounce off the wall, and every time they bounce off each other, they knock the rough edges off of each other, and then out of there you bring these beautiful gyms where marriage helps shape you to be more like Jesus. Marriage helps grow you and helps make you, well, I'll tell you, it shines a mirror on your face. It shows you a lot of things about yourself that you hid from other people pretty successfully as a single person. And then in marriage, it's like bright as day. And then there are some things about yourself you realize, oh, I even hid that from me. I successfully hid that part of me from me. And then these things show up in your life, and you can either grab hold of them for dear life and say, I'm never going to change, it's me, that's who I am, or you let God shape you through this relationship. And the two of you come together, and you submit one to another out of reverence for Christ. Far from one of us being property, far from one of us always getting our way and the other just having to deal with it. By the way, it's also far from the saying, happy wife, happy life. It's a real human relationship. Now, I'll sometimes sit down with some friends or some people at a church or whatever, and they'll start talking to me about some sort of like, ha-ha this, ha-ha that, funny snafu they had, and blah, blah, blah. It's a funny story, and then halfway through this funny story, I realize at some point they're going to stop and just look at me. And they're going to be like, now it's your turn to talk, Garrett. And what are they saying? Whose side are you on? Who's right, who's wrong? Pick a team, Garrett, right? And I always sit there and I think, no. Don't try to get me on one of your teams. You two are the team. You're the team. It's not me and you and then this person's out cold. No, you two are the team. You're the two that are bound in this thing called marriage to go through life together. Stop getting other people outside your marriage to try to team up on your spouse with you. No, you are the team. You have to work through this. You have to figure this out yourself. And just because I come along and I say, man, I really think you're right here, doesn't mean that that's going to fix your marriage. Me just saying, I'm super smart, I read the Bible this morning, I know what I'm talking about, let's go with this person's idea. That's not going to solve whatever disagreement is truly going on in the marriage. You got to figure out how to deal with that like a married couple. And you got to learn, okay, we both really kind of want different things. We both operate different ways in moments of crisis, or we both operate different ways when we try to make decisions or life choices, or these kind of things. How are we going to move forward? And I think it would be great if you could figure out a sort of a system, okay? Is it something that one of you cares about and the other doesn't care at all? Why not let the person who cares about it decide? Is it something where it literally doesn't matter? Why don't you just take turns saying, I don't care, what do you think? If there's some sort of danger that someone's trying to avoid, can we have that conversation? Like, what's the sort of thing? And then, and here's the problem, because I know what you're all thinking. You can take that down. We're talking about marriage. We're not talking about love here, okay? You all identify that a little much there, okay? But here's what you're thinking. You're thinking, Gary, I know this whole partnership thing sounds great, but what about this verse here that says, wives, submit to your husbands? What is that about? All the women got really interested in this one. Okay. Here's the best I can figure.
Better get this one right.
It's gonna be exactly right, Dallas. You know how when there's two business partners go into business together and the sort of it's drawn up with a 51%, 49% co-ownership, where it's like, yeah, we're doing this team thing together, we're doing the whole, it's all going to be teamwork, but at some point you have to have some sort of system where you kind of say, if we can't move beyond this, who's going to get final say, right? What's it going to look like? How's that moment where we just kind of reach this crossroads and we can't move forward? How do we do that? How do you move forward? Because you can't just stay there forever. This is, I think, what's happening here. Where in those moments where you kind of go, okay, we're just not going to see necessarily eye to eye, or we don't know what the right thing is. Someone just needs to make a decision. Paul says, wives, let your husband take the decision. And then he looks at the husbands. He says, now, husbands, love your wives like Christ loves the church. As you take this leadership role, you should love your wives as your own bodies. Because he who loves his wife loves himself. To lovingly care for your wife is not just self-sacrifice. It's actually building a better life for yourself as well. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they cared for their body. And I'll give you an example from my life. When we moved to Raleigh to help start a church, there's a lot of... we moved from Savannah, which is my hometown. My family lives there. Her family lived there. Her whole family lives there at this point. All of our friends were there. All of our network and connections were there. And it was the hardest move of our lifetime. Moving here from Raleigh was way easier than it was leaving Savannah to go to Raleigh. And it was a decision that was going to that weighed very heavy on Megan's heart. It caused a lot of concern, and I don't know what's going to happen. How am I going to know this is going to work out? What's going to be going on? And by the way, it was also a decision that was going to end up making her cry every other Thursday for about 4 or 5 months, okay? It just was going to be that. It was that. Do you know what would have been super unfair to Megan in that situation? If I would have said, hey, you know this decision that's going to just kind of tear you to shreds? You should be the one that has to make the decision. You decide for us against what you want and against what you want to have happen. You be the one that decides to pull yourself out of the family. That would have been so unfair to make her make the decision that's going to cause her to be crying over these decisions for a little while. But rather, Paul says, Garrett, don't do that to her. If it's the right thing to do, you make the choice. If it's what you need to do, you make the decision. And if it succeeds, great. And if it fails, point to yourself. It's on you. And so no matter what happens, there's never going to be a time where I'm going to go up to Megan and go, see, I told you she should have never done this because it was my choice. And she submitted to it. It's where life really, it's where the rubber meets the road. And decisions like that are hard. And Paul is looking at men and saying, guys, we need to take the leadership role. And hopefully those situations don't come up all that often. And they don't, by the way. And as we do, we should love our wives as we love ourselves. Knowing that whatever decision we make may weigh heavy on them, and we should care about that. And, you know, through moments like that, your marriage grows. Your relationship bond gets tighter. And you realize, wow, this really is an environment that is beneficial to human growth, personal growth, and human flourishing. And then there's this thing in Christian families called kids. Good gracious, we got kids. And did you hear what the idea with family in the time that Paul was writing to? It was all about the man. Whatever he wanted, he could just kind of do type stuff. And if it was not the kind of kid he wanted, if he was sickly or whatever, we just kind of throw him to the curb and let him go, right? And back then, it was kids were just kind of at their life was on the line, right? They could just be aborted or thrown out to die of exposure because the dad didn't want them, and blah blah blah. And now there's also, but then there's also this other aspect of kids in a family where they kind of view it as like this safe harbor they never have to leave, and I'm going to be bound to my family forever because they're my safety blanket or whatever. And then there's some of us who view our families of origin like this hellscape that we can't wait to escape. And right, and Paul's looking at all of us going, no, that's not the family. The family's not this thing that's just at the whim of the dad, and this family's not this thing that the kids just never leave, and this family's also not something they can't wait to get out of. The family is an environment where these kids grow. They grow in the shadow of the relationship of their parents. And the parent's job is not to hold on to them forever or to drive them away, but rather train them so they can launch them into their lives. You are prepared. You are ready. Now go. And Paul said, he quotes Genesis, he says, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. And they will become one flesh. And they'll start this thing called marriage and family. And they'll move forward into the future. And they'll have kids. And they'll train them up. And they'll launch them into the world. Not driving them away, not exasperating them, but helping them know how to live life. Because the family is the most healthy, safe, and beneficial environment for personal growth and human flourishing. I want to end talking about the success of Christian families. The success of what Paul has drawn up for us in the Bible here. It is actually this image, this was not how families were just drawn up at the time, where mom, dad at top, kids below, and it's just sort of this minivan of people moving in the same direction. It's not, that was kind of new. but it has been so successful, and it's made its way through history to where it actually got a name called the nuclear family. We kind of have an identity for it now. And what happened when Christianity introduced this kind of family into the world at the time, things started changing. The world started flipping upside down. At the time in the Greco-Roman world, it was common for girls to be married to men much older than they were at 13, 14, sometimes 12. Like, it was crazy. And inside the church, the average age for girls getting married immediately shot up to 18, 19, 20, something what we would consider normal. It was never normal before. And they immediately got freedom and choice of who they're going to marry, and because of it, women flocked to the church. I can't believe someone actually thinks a family can operate this way. And for the first time, women were not forced to abort their babies or throw them out because they were unwanted, and so they were allowed to keep their babies, and more women flocked to the church. I can't believe it. I can just have my baby and keep it. It's going to be amazing. Even if it's a girl, it's going to be so wonderful. And women just flocked to the church. And not only did they not do that, the church started going around and finding babies left on doorsteps and in dumpsters and adopting them. Christians basically invented orphanages because of their view of the family and the human and the value of what a human being is. Kids, their danger immediately transformed, flipped. Every child's wanted. Every person's accepted. In their day, if a woman's husband died, she was forced to go get married as quickly as possible because she was a burden to society. In the early church, Rodney Stark says this: if anything, widows were mildly encouraged not to get married. You're just part of the team. You're part of the crew. You can be a whole person and single at the same time. No one ever heard that before. Unfortunately, people almost don't hear that anymore either. But in the church, things just started changing, and it was successful. Today, the success of people's families tells us a lot about them. The single greatest common denominator among people in prisons today is not skin color or income or anything like that, but rather they didn't have both mom and dad at home. That married men over their lifetime will make more money than men who stay single, even if they're working the same kind of job, because family just kind of drives them to say, I gotta provide for people, I gotta do things, and what you find is that as people participate in their families, they grow, and human life flourishes because the Christian version of family has been successful. It is successful still. The question is, why, if it's so good, do they end so often? Our culture's answer to that is that maybe because something about the institution itself is broken. And that's not true. Because it is being successful in lives across the world right now. The reason is because it's hard. Is because it involves adjusting to each other. It involves me moving towards you and you moving towards me. And we don't do everything the way my parents did things in their house, and we don't do everything the way she did in her house. We are building our own house. And sometimes you talk to people and you realize, oh, you got into this marriage and it never even registered, that you never even considered that you would adjust to the other person. You decided you were going to stay the same person forever. And sometimes you look at me and you realize, oh, you got into this marriage and it never even occurred to you that you were going to have to love this woman. And some women were like, what are you talking about? I'm not going to respect my husband. And it never even occurred to you. And you refuse to adjust. And that won't work in a marriage. Marriage is there's too much going on for us to be that self-centered, that hard-hearted, that stagnant, and just refusing to move. Marriage is so good, but it's hard. And we have to allow it to shape us. And we have to allow ourselves to adjust to the other person, or we're not going to make it work. And our theme for the year 2024 Does anybody know, by the way? No? Spiritual friendships. Growing in friendship with God and growing in friendship with each other. And the line we keep coming back to with this idea of our relationship with God is that the more we walk into His way of life, the more we realize that God's not a tyrant, He's a friend. That when we follow His way, we come out the beneficiary. He doesn't just give rules to push us around. He gives rules because He loves us. And He's a friend. Rodney Stark wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity. And it's a sociologist's take on why Christianity grew so quickly. And there are times where it gets a little mathematic for my liking, but it's a really interesting book. But at the very end of it, he ends with just a 2-page chapter on the Christian virtues and the fact that Christians follow the doctrines of the Bible. He said one of the most meaningful reasons for why the church grew so quickly was the way that the doctrines of the Bible took on flesh within the Christians. He said, books don't have ethics. People have ethics. And it's when people live out the doctrines of the Bible that things start to change. And he says this, in his very last lines, and I don't get emotional very often, but I got emotional reading in my office this week. He says this: if Christians effectively promulgated a moral vision utterly incompatible with the casual cruelty of the pagan customs. He said, finally, what Christianity gave to its converts was nothing less than their humanity. What God gave His followers was nothing less than their humanity. In this sense, Rodney Stark says, virtue was its own reward. Our God is not a tyrant. He's a friend. And the theme song for our year 2024 is the goodness of God. And we're about to sing it. And here are the words we're going to sing. I've known you as a father, and I've known you as a friend, and I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been good. And here's my prayer for you. That as you live in your families, and as some of you prepare to one day be families, and some of you and as we just follow Jesus through the life He has for us, we will come to say the same thing. I have seen the goodness of God. I have lived in His ways, and I can tell you He is not a tyrant, but He's a friend. And as we do, I pray that we will allow, like Paul suggests, over and over and over and over and over and over and over, that we invite Christ into every aspect of our families. That our love will be as Christ loves. That our respect will be as we respect Christ. That our honor will be in the Christ. And that He will be all through it. Because it's hard. Families are hard. But they are their own reward. Because in the family, God made the most safe, beneficial environment for personal growth and human flourishing if you and I are willing to engage with it.